CEO of World Wildlife Fund in the United States. And Bill Riley, who was one of my mentors, always said to me, if you may recall, he was one of the early heads of the EPA and one of the CEOs of WWF. He always said the practice in the Bush White House was to have a small room with a limited number of chairs, so people just felt lucky to be there. And so we got a packed room today, which is great, and we also have an amazing set of U.S. government leaders here and leaders from Vietnam to talk about nature-based solutions. It wasn't so long ago that we had a COP in Montreal that was groundbreaking in terms of the world's commitment to nature. And Senator Cardin and I were just talking about, it wasn't so long ago that the counterpart agreement in Paris set the stage for climate. And today we're coming together to talk about both, and we're going to talk about the role of the U.S. government in advancing solutions at the intersection of the two. And I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Senator Cardin, who is chair of the all-important Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, which is connected to the Appropriations Committee. Those two are fundamental to the role of the United States in all of the world. And Senator Cardin has represented my state of Maryland with great distinction for many, many years, and we're delighted for you to open this session.
Well, Carter, first of all, thank you very much. It's nice to know we have some Marylanders here. And, we got a couple other Marylanders here? All right. That's good. JR, are you live in Maryland now? No? So you have a very distinguished panel that I'm the, I guess, the warm-up act for. J.R. Littlejohn's particularly important to me because she's a graduate from Morgan State University, which is one of my favorite HBCUs, and is doing an incredible job here. So you have another really distinguished member of the panel known as Chris Coons. You have a really good panel coming up. This is my 5th COP meeting. I really do want to thank you, Carter, for what you do for nature, what your organization does. It's incredible efforts, and we recognize how critically important these issues are to our wildlife. So thank you for everything that you do. I am heading up 7 United States senators that have come to this COP, bipartisan group of senators that recognize the urgency of the situation. I've already acknowledged Senator Coons, but we have Senator Murkowski, who's joined us. We have Senator Tom Carper, the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Whitehouse, who chairs the Budget Committee. We have Senator Markey, who's been one of the great leaders on climate for a long time, and Senator Schatz, who is on the Foreign Relations Committee and Appropriations Committee. But the one we give the highest recognition to is the person who controls the money, Senator Coons, who chairs the subcommittee that deals with a lot of these appropriation issues. So if you have any tough questions on why we're not giving more money, talk to Senator Coons. He's the one who can help you figure this out. But I really wanted you to know we're here because we are concerned, we're engaged, and we're ready to take action. There's many reasons for this. We're at a crisis with the severe weather events, with the wildfires, with the extreme storms, with the floodings, the droughts. We're at a crisis situation for our environment. But I chair the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And yes, I am very concerned about our environment, but it goes beyond just our environment. It's our national security that's at stake. Because we have nations today whose stability is being questioned because of the climate issue. And when you have instability, you have violence. And when you have violence, it leads to conflict. And when you have conflict, you need soldiers. And sometimes they're U.S. soldiers. So we're invested in this for a lot of different reasons. And we know that there are going to be a lot of climate migrants. The projection is by 2050, we could have as many as 150 to 200 million people who are displaced because of climate. That's of concern. Yes, we recognize that the borders are a challenge throughout the world, including the United States of America. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to be concerned about these issues. And that's why we're so pleased that you're having this panel discussion. I am proud of what the United States has been able to do. You'll hear this more and more during this conference. We were here last year in Glasgow in Egypt, at Sharm el-Sheikh, to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act that passed. That was a once in a generation. That's a permanent law, by the way. That law is taking effect. We're implementing it as we speak, and it's making a huge difference in the investment of the solutions to our climate challenges. But we've done a lot more than that. I know there's a lot of attention on the Green Climate Fund and on this new fund. I got to make sure I get the U.S. title correctly. I can't say loss and damage, whatever they call it now. But it's the fund. Look at what the United States has done. We have $1 billion in the Green Climate Fund, but we have, and the numbers I understand are a little bit higher than were given to me before, but if you look what USAID is doing, and we have people here from USAID who will talk about all the projects in the Global South that we're doing in regards to energy, renewable projects, or just starting solar manufacturing facilities, and the list goes on and on and on. But we're also doing it through the Development Financing Corporation. We're engaged in a lot of projects dealing with climate. We're doing it through the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And if you add that up over the last 2 years, it's in excess of $8.5 billion. So I make no apologies for the U.S. We're in the leadership on this, as we should be. And should we do more? Absolutely. We all have to do more. We're going to take stock at this COP28. And it will tell us that we are not on target yet to reach the 1.5. We've got to do more. All of us together. Those of us in government with the help of the private sector. And the interesting thing about how we have provided some of these help, it not only solves the challenges for nature and our environment, it also gives sustainability for energy, for the economy, for good jobs. The U.S. programs are not the type of programs that we go in and try to get nations to give up their resources or become dependent upon debt. We do it in a way so that countries can grow and we can have stronger countries. That's what our objective is, and that's why I am so pleased that you have a panel that will help us determine what we can do more. All of us, together, we can accomplish these results. It's a very distinguished panel, and now I'm going to excuse myself because I heard you might be asking questions, and I want to make sure the people here have a chance to answer it. But thank you all for being here, and we got work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I now want to ask the panel to join me on stage. And I want to make sure I get all the titles right, but I wanted to start with the Assistant for the State Department, the Acting Assistant Secretary for Bureau of Oceans and Environmental and Scientific Affairs, Jennifer Littlejohn. Welcome, and please come on up. I wanted to, the aforementioned Senator Coons, who indeed is in a pivotal position as the chair of the Subcommittee for Appropriations on Foreign Operations and State. He has been an absolute lion on biodiversity issues, conservation issues. There's so many pieces of legislation that bear his imprint and his name. And I'd love Senator Coons to please come on up on stage. Welcome. I wanted to welcome Rick Duke, who is the Deputy Special Envoy for Climate with John Kerry, who has not slept for many years, and but has been busy at work, particularly on this intersection of climate and nature. And last but not least, I wanted to ask Gillian Caldwell, who is the chief climate scientist for USAID, and given the role that USAID plays throughout the world on behalf of the U.S. government, I wanted to welcome you up on stage too. Now, in order to give you guys time to think about what you're going to say, I'm going to deliver a few remarks, but I'll be as quick as I can possibly be. I mentioned earlier on that anyone who thinks the environmental crisis is just about climate change would be missing a whole lot. And did somebody shout out civil society in the back of the room? But it is true that government plays a key role, civil society does too, and communities do too. I wanted to just say, though, for me, the two horsemen of the apocalypse are it's climate change and the loss of biodiversity in the world. And together they constitute, our ability to respond to those two crises will either determine whether we are able to save our home, which is planet Earth, or not. And they are wound up and together like two strands of a helix. You can't solve climate change without addressing the loss of nature and biodiversity. All told, nature and biodiversity, land use and deforestation constitutes estimated 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So good luck solving climate change without that. And on the other side, you can't save nature without solving climate change, given how much it multiplies all the threats in the world. And last but not least, what Senator Durbin just talked about is really Ben Cardin, sorry, not Durbin, Cardin, just talked about. What Senator Cardin just talked about is very much in front of us. And the World Economic Forum, when it looks at the top 6 risks to the global economy and color codes them based on what type of sector they represent, 4 of the top 6 are all coded green. And they all have to do with climate change and loss of biodiversity. And they all have to do with the ability of the world to grow food, to provide for people. And when you break the back of that by deforestation, loss of habitat, or climate change, and you end up with droughts in parts of the world that we know all too well that don't have good enough governance, people have to move. And they move in countries, they move outside of countries, and it destabilizes the entire world. And the role of the United States in all of this is profound. I have more colleagues in the WWF network who knew more about the US political system than most of our staff do. And they know more about the Electoral College than most of our staff do. The world watches what the US does. And that's why this panel is so profoundly important, because for me, as someone who was born and raised in the United States and loves my country, I just know the extraordinary levers that we can pull to help other nations of the world and communities and people in the world to get to the right side of the equation that we talked about. So we know that on the one hand, the world is desperately trying to stay below 1.5 degrees C. And on the other hand, WWF produced a report, the Living Planet report. We produced it for 40 years. The latest one in 2022 showed that we have lost 70% of the population of animal species in the world over the past 50 years. 70%. So we are nearing all kinds of tipping points. And for WWF, we work with the biggest companies in the United States on making their own science-based commitments and also driving through their supply chains changes in the way the world produces food. We work with US government agencies and teeing up some of the biggest initiatives in the world in conservation. And we are also part of an amazing initiative called Enduring Earth, which is teeing up what we call Project Finance for Permanence, which is set aside 15% of the Amazon, with the biggest project in Brazil, another huge one in Colombia, that sources in big amounts of capital to both build a new trajectory for rural economic development for communities, but also set aside huge chunks of forest. It's the biggest conservation play in the world. And the United States government is playing a key role in these kind of projects throughout the world. So with that, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to shut up, except for asking our panelists some questions. And let me just start with let me get to my third page with Assistant Secretary Littlejohn. So your office in the State Department has been a part of all kinds of global agreements, all the ones that we've mentioned. And although the U.S. is not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, we are a force for teeing up and supporting unbelievable initiatives around the world. So I just want you to just comment on how does the State Department and your office think about the role that the U.S. plays in helping the world get to 30% of land conserved and staying below 1.5 degrees C?
Well, thank you so much for the question. And thank you for the invitation to be here amongst this tremendous panel. I'm humbled. So what I would start by saying is that we recognize that to unlock the power of nature to address climate change, both by mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and building resilience, as well as to conserve biodiversity and support people, we really have to focus more. And we have to kind of dig deep, because the truth of the matter is, I'm not going to bury the lead, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, we need resources. No way around it. And we need those resources to come from all sources: governments, MDBs, civil society, the private sector, and philanthropies. Now, as a veteran diplomat of over 20 years, I can say that we have a very vital role to play, and this will be the focus of my response to your comment. Diplomacy can set in motion international collaboration, commitments, and actions. We have seen this happen in many of the agreements that you just outlined, which we're very excited about, frankly. We have seen it in the Glasgow Declaration, in which the United States joined the commitment to halt and reverse global forest loss and land degradation by 2030. Through diplomacy, we also work to turn these commitments into action. We work with international organizations, individual countries, and through the public-private partnerships that we have to conserve oceans, tropical forests, coral reefs, and other ecosystems. These connections are exactly, and I think get to your point, exactly what we need to mobilize the whole of society approach required to halt and reverse nature loss. And again, that includes financing. Now, the United States is one of the largest donors to the Global Environment Facility, with about $600 million in the latest replenishment. And we are also seeing a new and exciting means to structure and leverage financing, one of which is the newly established Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, which we're excited about. Now, this fund can now accept contributions from private sectors and philanthropies. So this is significant because we know government budgets and resources could be tight in the coming years, right? So we must mobilize funding from all sources. The U.S. government can help leverage private funding to address the catastrophic decline in nature, however. Now, this is why we are excited about new models of financing, including legislation currently being considered in the U.S. Congress to establish an International Conservation Foundation. This legislation's bipartisan and bicameral support reflect what we have realized, and that is that we need to mobilize funding, once again, as I mentioned, from all sources. And that additional resources for the U.S. government can help leverage private funding to address the catastrophic decline in nature. Now, consistent with this bipartisan support for nature conservation, which we greatly appreciate, supports this also resources for the United States to join with other partners. Now, with Congress ready to take action, another nod, on both authorizing and appropriating such an approach, we're here to work on leveraging resources in new ways, including with the private sector. It's clear that in areas like nature conservation, the private sector, governments, and a variety of other potential contributors are eager to help. So the U.S. government has some great steps to build on, frankly. But the United States already supports countries to conserve forests and nature through our 25-year-old Debt for Nature swap program under the Tropical Forest and Coral Conservation Act. We recently signed $15 million in an agreement with Peru with major support from NGOs, including the World Wildlife Fund. Pause. To support conservation and sustainable livelihoods in the Amazon. Now, this, we believe, will have real impact. We are also helping bring the private sector to the table. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation is providing political risk insurance so that the private sector can confidently participate in game-changing deals like financing $656 million marine conservation bonds to protect the unique ecosystems and species of the Galapagos Islands. We are using leveraged approaches in other sectors as well for nature and environmental protection. In September, the State Department launched a new international public-private partnership called the End Plastic Pollution International Collaborative, or has a good name, EPIC. Working with the private sector, governments at all levels, and civil society, EPIC will incentivize investment and solutions to end plastic pollution, starting upstream. Now, the Department of State has provided $14.5 million in funding, and we are working to attract 5 times that amount in external funding. And this is part of our effort to broaden the donor base. Broaden the donor base by encouraging partnerships with other governments and non-government actors. And so I'll end by saying at the State Department, we look forward to continuing our work with Congress, with other U.S. agencies, especially USAID and the International Development Finance Corporation, and with non-governmental and international partners to find new ways to leverage resources in support of this incredibly important work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, right before I came up, I heard that Rick was going to have to leave early. And Senator, I hope you don't mind waiting a little bit longer, but okay. Rick is now given the space back to the senator, so I'm coming back to you. My colleagues in the world, every time there is a new president elected in the United States, think that everything changes. And I try to tell them, actually it matters who's president of the United States. It also matters who's in Congress. And it matters the rest of our states and cities and all the complexity of our country that is not defined by a single person. And you have been a champion. And I use that word quite appropriately. For those of you who don't know, Senator Coons is amazing. And you have conjured out of a divided Congress some of the most important bits of legislation and commitments. And that range, well, you can tell us all about some of them, but I think what the audience would also be most interested in is how the heck do you do that? That you operate in that zone between two parties that are so divided and you get stuff done. Because I think that's something we all have to do in the divided world we have today.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you. Thank you to this panel and to the World Wildlife Fund for the remarkable leadership you've shown now over so many years. To your core question, which is, should we all be terrified that one outcome of the upcoming U.S. presidential election would lead to a complete withdrawal of the United States from our various financing commitments, from our leadership on the world stage, from our engagement around climate change? Well, having lived through it relatively recently, I will tell you that in the 2016 to 17 transition, yes, the then new President Trump walked away from the Paris climate commitments, made some significant changes in terms of the regulatory trajectory in the United States. But for those who are concerned that the groundbreaking Inflation Reduction Act commitments signed into law by our President Joe Biden, passed through the Senate and House, nearly $400 billion. So far, $300 billion in new projects are online, committed or underway. It will end up actually spending a lot more than $400 billion. I'll just give you a quick factoid if you want to be encouraged. even when President Trump was in the White House and when Republicans controlled both the House and Senate, the structural financial incentives for renewables, the investment tax credit and production tax credit for solar and wind, stayed in place. I fully expect that the Inflation Reduction Act incentives will stay in place regardless of who is in control in the White House or in Congress. A. B. Is the climate crisis accelerating? Absolutely. We need to do more. You heard from Chairman Cardin. We need to be more ambitious. We need to invest more. We need to engage more. But even in that challenging period in 2016-17, the subnational level at the United States, we had cities and states and private sector leaders in our companies who continued to meet our Paris commitments. The United States continued to reduce significantly its emissions. Does it matter? Absolutely it matters. I am a co-chair of the Biden-Harris reelection campaign, forgive me, for one critical reason, which is I am convinced that President Biden's leadership on climate will continue, and I'm convinced that his likely opponent would take us in a different direction. Let me stop at the politics there. Let me also highlight that this is a bipartisan delegation, House and Senate. We have Republican members of the House and Senate here who agree that the climate is changing, that human activity is causing it, that it's a crisis, and we need to make progress on it. They aren't willing to invest more in the Green Climate Fund. In my subcommittee, where Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina is my important ranking member, he is willing, and so are many other Republicans, to robustly invest in protecting nature, in nature-based solutions, in investing in conservation, and in particular in the initiatives that you mentioned and my legislation that you cited several times there. With Lindsey Graham and a bipartisan group in the House and Senate, the International Foundation for Conservation is a vehicle to robustly scale our nation's investments, public money matched by philanthropic and private money, to address the dramatic loss in biodiversity, the dramatic loss in ecological resources in the developing world, in partnership with the Global South, in partnership with communities, in a way that would focus on human development first. And I'm conscious of time, so I will stop, but just know that in the supplemental that many of us are urgently trying to get concluded, there's $10 billion of humanitarian relief that will help with food security. There's $2 billion to help unlock IMF and World Bank finance. And when we pass this year's appropriations bill, the subcommittee I chair, we will increase how much is available for conservation, how much is available for critical programs USAID is carrying forward that may not say climate change on the faceplate, but that are critical to our nation's commitment to the global efforts to scale renewable energy, to advance the clean energy transition, to make the contributions we've committed to a variety of international mechanisms, but also, frankly, to do our part as among the world's leaders in combating biodiversity loss and ecological loss. Thank you.
Okay. Now you know why we are such big fans of Senator Coons, who is, as he rolls his eyes appropriately, it does matter who sits in the White House, and our next speaker has been a part of a dream team that has been working these COPs and making things happen as part of the Biden administration. And Rick, you not only have been immersed in all of that, but you've also been driving some really cool initiatives and breakthroughs on the climate-nature nexus. And it would be great if you could talk about the things that you see, the things that are important to do, and the trajectory that we need to get to in the years ahead.
Yep. Thank you, Carter. And I want to start by genuinely thanking Senator Coons for your leadership on putting this higher on the agenda in Congress in a bipartisan fashion, and specifically for the work on initiatives like the U.S. Foundation for International Conservation, that is a fantastic mechanism to bring together different stakeholders to get the job done in a catalytic way. And I want to talk about how we are seeking to do that through other channels as well, and I think with some really important steps here at COP28 in the nature domain. So the United States has been privilege to co-chair with Minister Jinapor of Ghana the Forest Climate Leaders Partnership, the FCLP. And through the FCLP efforts, Secretary Kerry and Minister Jinapor and partners around the world have been able to come together and really put this question of forests and nature where it needs to be, which is top of the agenda for climate mitigation. When we look at what needs to happen to keep 1.5C within reach, it's of course energy transition. You have to cut non-CO2 superpollutants, and you have to preserve forests and deforestation by 2030, consistent with the Glasgow Declaration. And what we have here at COP is some nascent good news on how we can work together catalytically to make that happen. So for example, the United States, in close partnership with multiple agencies, but AID in the lead, has contributed $30 million to an effort just announced here at COP with the Democratic Republic of Congo to preserve peatlands, which are tremendously important biomes, also to invest in complementary investments like in clean electrification and e-cooking, but also sustainable agriculture and a range of other supportive investments from the private sector. And then to define and implement a path to high integrity carbon markets to have the sustained scaled finance that's really required for a country that is the second biggest source of deforestation globally and the last remaining net sink in a tropical forest biome to really be able to do what's required to preserve not just its peatlands, but its overall forests in a serious way. We were joined by other partners, Germany and France and others, philanthropies, and have mobilized over 60 million for DRC here at COP and 240 million for other forest climate partnerships, FCLP partnerships, including in Ghana and in a range of other countries. I want to just note that this does have those different elements in every case. There's a conservation element that's familiar, including longstanding leadership from groups like WWF, but we are really weaving together philanthropy and private sector and government action in order to get the job done with what are inevitably scarce resources in every case. I'll give you an example. In Brazil, where the good news is that they have actually, under President Lula's leadership, cut deforestation rates nearly in half since he took office. They have, of course, the Amazon Fund, and President Biden announced $500 million over 5 years, working with Congress to support efforts there. But also, we're using tools like our Development Finance Corporation that is investing alongside partners in a $1 billion land restoration for timber fund in Brazil. And we're applying those tools of our Development Finance Corporation in a range of geographies, and including in areas like debt for nature swaps and the like. So there's an investment piece that can be catalytically powered by our development finance institutions, and we're doing that work where we can. Then there is real progress on high integrity carbon markets in this sector, and we need to not lose sight of that. Just here at COP, we saw Costa Rica and Ghana move ahead with initial transactions for LEAF, that is a jurisdictional high integrity carbon market. And we have a pathway to $150 million in such transactions in 4 countries next year. So it's a tapestry of tools, and we are doing the weaving with partners, and it is going to be essential that we continue to keep this as high on the agenda as it needs to be, and that we continue to be catalytic in the way that we do this work, because the problem is too important and too big for any one country or any one budget to carry all the weight. So that's the mode we're in, and with the partners that we have here at COP, including UAE that has really invested in this agenda, we're making some headway.
Great. Thanks so much. You guys have brought huge energy. Thank you so much for your leadership and the leadership of Special Envoy Kerry. And now he has to go. I want to turn to Gillian, and just before, Gillian plays a key role in USAID. USAID, the funds of USAID, who appropriates the funds for USAID? So when you look at this group on stage, there is an ecosystem in the U.S. government that lands on the ground in joint policies in the world, joint initiatives like the ones that Rick talked about, and jointly funded work on the ground that USAID often is in the lead role in making that happen. And I would just say the vast majority of WWF's work around the world, particularly with communities, rests on a partnership with USAID that means a lot to us, particularly in places like Namibia, where a groundbreaking program called Namibia the Life Project is one of the bright spots in Africa on restoration of species and the rebuilding of governance that benefits local communities. So as USAID navigates all these changes in the world, and you think about what it means, how your role is shifting, what are the new kinds of things that USAID will do and play to jumpstart these kind of really cool, innovative projects on the ground?
Thank you so much to everybody here, to Senator Coons for your leadership, to the State Department for your partnership, and likewise to you, Carter, and WWF. I think there's a consistent thread in this conversation, which is that we need all hands on deck to tackle the scope and scale of the twin biodiversity and climate crises. According to the OECD, it appears that developed economies may finally have reached the 100 billion committed under the Paris Agreement by 2022, and will almost definitely do so in 2023. But we know that's a drop in the bucket, given the scope and scale of the crisis. We need to get to 3 to 5 trillion a year by 2030 to tackle the mitigation and adaptation costs combined, which is why you're hearing so much about partnership with the private sector. And I think there are some people that express concern about those kinds of partnerships, right? Because we recognize that there are instances in which companies are driving the crises we're talking about. Yet at the same time, there is, I think, a new generation of leadership in the private sector that is consistently referring to the fact that we're moving beyond so-called CSR or corporate sustainability to a recognition that it's a C-suite concern, that if they don't get it right with respect to the climate and the biodiversity crisis, they simply can't continue to perform in the market. Not just because of the public pressure and consternation they'll face, but because their supply chains depend on it. So we have a lot of willing partnership, and if we can really engage local communities, indigenous people and local communities in the conversation and shaping those solutions, there are important opportunities. So, you know, in the last 5 years alone, USAID has catalyzed more than $1 billion in private sector support, specifically focused on biodiversity conservation and tackling the climate crisis. We established a whole-of-agency effort on climate in 2022. We have a strategy taking us through 2030 that has ambitious goals, including cutting carbon emissions by 6 billion metric tons. That's the equivalent of 1.5 times all U.S. emissions in 2021. And underpinning that strategy is nature-based solutions, where we are working to protect and preserve 100 million hectares of carbon critical landscape. And in fiscal 22 alone, we were able to preserve over 50 million hectares, many of which are in the carbon critical landscapes of Brazil, which other colleagues have spoken about. We're also, of course, looking at adaptation and resilience, and going to reach 500 million people worldwide through that work. But to give you some concrete examples, going back to Namibia, that was such an important partnership, Carter, and we really appreciated your support as well as the support of the local NGOs that worked on delivering that. And I think what was important there were several dimensions. One is that, you know, it was the whole project was underpinned by a careful economic analysis about the opportunities in that very arid landscape in Namibia. And there was a recognition that community-based land conservation and management was going to have to be at the heart of how we went about that work. And then we pivoted to a policy intervention to ensure an amendment to the Constitution which would enable conservancies. And today, 1 in 10 Namibians are members of land conservancies, which is a tremendous evolution. And I think that also points to the fact that, if you think about how the world changes, there's three primary levers. There's policy, there's people, and the purse, right? So we're talking about money and how it moves. We're talking about policy and the framework. And then there's the people on the ground that can make it happen. So over time, that project in Namibia, which had sustained long-term funding, I mean, our first investment there was a 5-year investment. It relates to what you're thinking about with the International Conservation Foundation Act, which is how we double or triple or quadruple our investment in the private sector through catalytic public sector finance for long-term locally based conservation. And I think that's the model that we saw in Namibia. To give you another example, in Ghana, where cacao is a primary source of revenue, we've been working to support local communities to advance climate-smart agricultural practices, to diversify their income, to enable them access to this growing premium market where many companies, of course, have made zero deforestation commitments, and they want to understand that those commitments are being upheld, connect these local farmers to whom we're providing the technical assistance with the markets they need to increase their income, all the while improving the biodiversity and advancing carbon mitigation. So, I mean, I think what we need to be thinking about is where we can shape holistic projects that look at each of these problems from multiple vantage points, because there are so many win-wins if we architect it carefully and with that locally based voice at the table.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to go back to the senator before the panel closes. And I want to, I'd love for you to talk more about this this foundation fund for this intersection. And it is one of the great good bits of good news coming out of Congress and will make a huge difference in projects around the world, like the PFPs that I talked about, that that leverage and source in all kinds of funding from around the world. And I'd love for you to just talk more about that, because your leadership, and by the way, having Senator Coons and Senator Graham get behind a single bill is quite unusual. And no, it's not. It's quite something. And this is a really important effort that will unlock all kinds of possibilities in the world.
So Carter, just, I am actively currently moving a range of different climate-related pieces of legislation. They're all with different senators.
Yeah.
Senator Kramer and I are doing the Prove It Act on emissions intensity. Senator Tillis and I just introduced the low carbon concrete initiative. It was with Senator Portman that we got an extension, a reauthorization of the debt for nature swaps for tropical rainforest. So Lindsey is not my only dance partner, but he is my most important dance partner, because Senator Graham will either be the chair or the ranking, depending, of our subcommittee. And having him as the principal co-author of this foundation is the result of years of travel and work together.
That's right.
There are, let's just pick Africa in particular, there's a lot of tremendous work being done by USAID. There's a lot of great work being done by our country's iconic conservation foundations. There's also a group of, I'll call them quirky billionaires, who are really invested in conservation in Africa. Finding a way to get them to all pull together and play well together and make long-term investments was the animating concern here.
Yeah.
When Lindsey came to me and said, I can't get you any more money for the GCF, I said, that's a problem. I want to figure out a way we can get $1 billion in U.S. public money dedicated to combating climate change that we will leverage 1 or 2 times. We'll get another 1 or 2 billion. And this was the structure we came up with. I want to recognize Rob Walton for his early initiative coming in with a $100 million pledge. We've got $100 million in this year's appropriation bill dedicated to it if we get it authorized. And Mike McCall, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a Republican from Austin, Texas, has said to me last weekend, this is his legacy objective, is to get this into law. So I am intentionally trying to build financing and funding vehicles that will survive regardless of which party is in control, that can lay the foundation for long-term partnerships, so that when we make international commitments in diplomatic circles, when we begin programmatic initiatives, it doesn't go away 2 years later or 3 years later. Part of what I struggle with is that, it was President Carter who first put, I think it was solar cells on the roof of the White House, and then the next administration tore them down. We have had a like this cycle for 40 years, for as long as I've been an adult. I'm trying to build things that will last beyond 1 or 2 political cycles. So I'm thrilled. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about it. I appreciate your support for this. And what I'm most optimistic will have happened by the time we gather at the next COP is that there will be a U.S.-led international conservation foundation.
Let me just say, you are a role model for what the rest of us should be doing on a daily basis, and really incredibly grateful. I wanted to thank the panel. You guys all do great work, and we're so proud of what the U.S. is able to, the difference it can make in the world, and the difference you guys are making and making it possible. So thank you all. Okay, as the panel leaves, I'm going to ask one last speaker to talk, and obviously there's one voice that hasn't been on stage today, and that's the voice of governments that the U.S. supports around the world, and Vietnam is one of those. And I wanted to just ask the government of Vietnam to join us, and particularly Pham Quan Huay, who is the counselor for economic affairs of the Vietnam Embassy in Washington. And Vietnam is a part of the world where one of the very largest grants that USAID has made to any country in the world for the biological conservation, $35 million, is now currently underway. WWF is partnering with the government of Vietnam. But welcome, and we'd love for you to talk about what that amazing initiative is doing.
Just a small correction. I'm agriculture counselor, not economic counselor at the Vietnam Embassy in the U.S. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And first, I would like to thank you, the WWF, for inviting me to join this exciting sections. And I'm also inspired with all your reflections and also and thoughts from the politicians and officials, as well as also the partners as well. And I also recorded and have so many notes. But of course, I'm not going to summarize it in the closing remarks, which I believe I cannot to do so. But instead, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight the USAID support for biodiversity conservation and saving the threatened wildlife in the Central Annamite in Vietnam through the partnership with the WWF. Of course, the Annamite is the English name of we call the Trường Sơn, the mountain range, and personally, I prefer to use the Trường Sơn and encourage you to do so as well, because the Trường Sơn is the longest mountain range in Vietnam, and it is considered as a natural museum of biology, biodiversity, and ethnology, history, and culture, and in which the biodiversity conservation is an essential component of achieving sustainable, resilient development, and as well as a global public good. And the U.S. Biodiversity Conservation Annamite project is a single largest ever investment in biodiversity conservation in Vietnam. The cost of the project is 43 million. Total cost is 43 million US dollars. And the project also taken a holistic and systematic approach towards improving the protected area management and protecting the wildlife in Vietnam. The project has worked with the local governments and communities and the private sector in Vietnam to reduce the deforestation and promote the conservation friendly enterprises, strengthen the functionality of the law enforcement to address the forest and wildlife crimes, and reduce the local consumer demand for illegal wildlife. The project also plays a critical role of Vietnam's forest for storing carbon, and providing the globally significant biodiversity. The successes to date in nature-based solution and forest conservation represent an excellent example and models for effective collaboration between our two countries and governments, and also this model should be scaled up in the time to come. And as regard to the result of the project, I would like to highlight some of the achievements of the projects, including the first is the scaling the community patrol teams now in all 21 protection and special use forests. Thus, projects is working on have removed and more than a total of more than 20,000 snares in 1 year alone. The second is more than 1,000 people have increased their income as a result of the project support for conservation-friendly livelihood. And the third, by the end of the project, the goal is to have 600,000 hectares of forest under improved management, and this area is equivalent to Delaware, the home state of the President Biden. And so far, okay, yeah, that's good. And the project also nearly reached this goal with more than 550,000 hectares under the improved management. And the next, this project together with USAID Saving Threatened Wildlife is also working to address one of the major contributors of biodiversity loss, the wildlife trafficking. In particular, the project also working with the government and private sector and civil society to develop the champions against the wildlife trafficking and reduce demand, and also working at the community level to raise awareness and education on environmental and health risks associated with the illegal wildlife product. These efforts also helping Vietnam reach its global climate biodiversity commitments and mitigate adverse climate change impacts, and ultimately pave the way for the more resilient and prosperous future. Last but not least, I would like to draw your attention that on September 11th, the General Secretary Nguyễn Phú Trọng of Vietnam and also the US President Joe Biden made announcement in Hanoi to elevate our bilateral relationships to become the comprehensive strategic partnerships. And in the joint statement, the two leaders also recognized the importance of the collaboration to promote, among others, climate smart agriculture, biodiversity conservation, low emissions, and resilience of vulnerable communities. So once again, congratulations WWF for the remarkable achievements, and thank you USAID for your strong support. And we look forward to our continued partnership and trust. So that's to build our cooperation and also to help Vietnam to become the strong, independent, prosperous, and resilient country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I have a disposition that predisposition to end things earlier rather than late. We're really early. And I want to suggest that there's a bit of time for a couple of questions. And I just thought while we have these three speakers here, that I'd open it up for just a couple of questions from the audience. And if you could make it a real question instead of a comment, that would be all the better. Yes. Wait. You can't just have a private little conversation. You need a microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Marie from RTI International. We're very lucky to have worked with you in the past. You mentioned the supplemental and the funding in there, not just for defense, but also for humanitarian and development as being important for food security and other things. I know that's very much still under negotiation. I know the whole package is very much still not guaranteed, but in particular, it seems like there may be more of a drive for the defense spending and less so for the USAID and state. And could you talk a little bit about how you feel specifically about that state and USAID funding and what its chances are?
I'm cautiously optimistic that the entire package will make its way through the Senate, presuming we were able to close the border security, which is a very, very problematic section. Before I left yesterday, I spoke to James Lankford and Chris Murphy and folks in the White House, and it's why I'm going back earlier than I might otherwise, because we have to do this next week. We just met with the Ukrainian delegation of the U.S.-Ukraine support. Big chunks of it, frankly, are budget support to sustain the operation of the Ukrainian government and its response to things like Russia's ongoing attacks on its energy infrastructure. A significant portion of it is humanitarian relief, and there are dozens of countries where the food and fertilizer costs have gone through the roof, and so there are significant hunger challenges. When there's hunger challenges in countries like Sudan or Somalia or Afghanistan or Central African Republic or Chad, it accelerates the instability that's caused in all those countries by fighting, and it accelerates the loss of natural habitat and resources. Hungry people go into the forests, cut down the forests, hunt, live off of bushmeat, and so I think there is a clear connection as we have more and more people who are being displaced globally by conflict. There is a specific $10 billion portion of this that is for humanitarian aid. In the Senate, we're pretty much exclusively talking about Gaza and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, but the vast majority of that funding will actually be spent in other countries by USAID through humanitarian assistance and through response to multiple crises in multiple countries. Did I answer your question?
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yes, over here.
Hi, Kelly Elward with the Wildlife Conservation Society. Thanks for being here, and thank you, WWF, for hosting. Fantastic session. Here at COP, the negotiations have been ongoing, and one of the big outcomes has been this new loss and damage fund. Pledges are being made. The U.S. government's made a small pledge as well. I've been tracking the Standing Committee on Finance, how to incorporate this new climate response fund into the finance mechanisms of the agreements. Would love to hear, knowing that the Green Climate Fund is going to be a challenge and the new $3 billion pledge the U.S. government has made, what is the forecast, what's the future for U.S. engagement on this new loss and damage fund? And is there, sorry to go on too much, is there any way to integrate further the objectives of the Climate Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, and others like the Desertification Convention, integrating and harmonizing the goals of multiple conventions?
I'm probably not the best person to answer this question. No, I'm not competent to answer this question. We did meet with Special Envoy Kerry as a delegation before coming here. I don't know how exactly the administration's funding request and their reallocation within existing appropriated funds will ultimately play out in terms of this new fund. Initially, it looked like we weren't going to get anything for the GCF last year because of Republican opposition. The House version of the SFOPS bill explicitly bars any future contributions to the GCF. This is a matter of semantics, in my view. We are making $1 billion contribution across a half dozen other lines of effort, almost all run by USAID through conservation, combating biodiversity loss. It isn't going through the Green Climate Fund, but it's going to combat climate change in the world. Bruce Westerman, conservative Republican from Arkansas, chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the House, all in for nature-based solutions. Happy to sign off on robust investments in forestry, in combating deforestation. You ask him to sign, excuse me, I'm just sort of paraphrasing here. I don't speak for Bruce, but he's not going to vote for $1 billion for the Green Climate Fund, but he would likely support robust investments in combating deforestation. We have to navigate the politics that we have in the United States. And so I think our ongoing leadership across these different areas, these different lines of effort, is what's important to sustain rather than any one specific fund.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, the way it breaks down in budgetary terms for the agencies is this tug and pull between the bilateral support and the multilateral support. And Congress is typically, but not exclusively, more supportive of the bilateral support of the kind that USAID puts forward. When large multilateral contributions are made in the absence of an increase in the budgetary top line, that reduces the bilateral support. And we need both multilateral and bilateral contributions. They both serve a very important role in the global architecture and our ability to advance the work. But it is a challenge when we aren't able to better resource what is the defining crisis of our time. Climate gets a combined 1% in USAID states' budget. If you look at the total state aid budget combined, which is really surprising. At the same time, the U.S. government has, in 2023, contributed an estimated $9.3 billion in direct and indirect support to address the climate crisis. So it's not an inconsequential amount of money, but I think that we need to take a hard look at the priorities and recognize the cascading impacts that the climate and biodiversity crisis are having on everything else we care about, whether it's migration or food security or our national security. Thanks.
Great. Okay, last question, and then I'll give you guys a chance to say one last word.
Thank you both so much. My name's Tony. I'm with Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. This COP has had a tremendous focus on youth and youth involvement in the climate movement specifically, and domestically. How, Senator, do you think youth can be involved to effectively shape the way we are thinking about our climate future? And how do you think youth can be involved in shaping the way these $9.3 billion are invested moving forward?
This may not be the answer you expect. So I'm the co-chair of the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is bipartisan. 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats. My co-chair is a guy named Mike Braun of Indiana. You may not have heard of Senator Braun. He is among the most conservative members of the Senate. I mean, way over here. When I first asked him, what made you, he came to me about co-chairing this Climate Solutions Caucus. 2 things. Personal experience of having a family-owned forest over decades and seeing the impact of climate personally on that forest. Second, the National College Republicans asked him to speak at their national convention. And what did they want him to talk about? Climate change. He said, you know, at the end of the day, every senator is a parent or grandparent. Most of us are grandparents. And we want our kids or grandkids to admire us, to believe that we did something important. In some ways, the most important impact that young Americans and young people around the world have is in pressing and questioning and challenging the decisions being made by their parents and grandparents. Because for most of us, what we care about more than anything else is our children's future. I have 3 kids. One leans conservative. He's the one who sounds to the left of Bernie Sanders on climate and has said to me repeatedly, "Great job leaving me an uninhabitable planet, Dad." And I mean, I adore him, but he is fierce and forceful in his advocacy, as are all 3 of my children. So the voice of young people around the world is critical on its own, but it's also critical in relation to the generations who may not be as alarmed because our time horizon is relatively short. But when our children say to us, "I'm considering not having children because this planet will be uninhabitable for them," that has profound power. So be hopeful, be determined, but be relentless. Thank you.
Could I just comment quickly on that? I couldn't agree more with everything you said. I'm not a grandparent yet, but might be headed there soon. USAID really recognizes the power and potential of youth, and that's why our strategy has focused both on Indigenous people and local communities and women, youth, and kind of marginalized groups writ large. And I think youth have obviously had an enormous influence on the shape and scope of ambition that governments have been prepared to deliver. You know, the sit-ins, Greta Thunberg, and so many others have really, I think, pushed the envelope. But more than anything, I was on a panel yesterday with a 16-year-old named Francisco. No, he's 14-year-old named Francisco. And he said, in response to the adage that youth are our future and we owe them a debt, we can't hand them an unlivable planet. He said, we're not just the future, we're the present. We're here now. Engage us. You know, help us be part of the solution. And one of the projects that we have at USAID is specifically focused on helping youth develop data-driven evidence to support their arguments for policy interventions, because they do deserve a seat at the table, and their voice is incredibly powerful for all the reasons you stated, Senator Coons. Thanks.
As someone who went to a certain school in the middle of New Jersey with Halloween colors for its school colors, I knew there was a reason I called on you. So thank you for that. It was a great question. I want to give each of you just one final parting shot. Something you wish you'd said or you wish we'd heard. And if you have nothing to say, that's fine too. But I wanted to give you each a moment for one last parting shot.
Well, it's a little inside baseball, but since we talked about the Tropical Forests and Coral Reef Conservation Act, I wanted to note that, there's a limited, it's so important. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary, and, we've galvanized over $350 million by kind of repurposing debt that countries owe the United States for conservation. But there's a limited amount of debt that's actually eligible under that act, either because the countries don't meet the democracy standards or because the debt itself doesn't fit into the timeline and criteria. And I think we need to take a fresh look at this question of debt, and especially at private debt, because the debt crisis is mounting, and so much of that debt is commercial. So this is just an encourage to all of us to think about this. I know the DFC is engaged in some important transactions on this front, helping provide underlying guarantees to enable the private sector to help convert some of that debt, which may never be repayable in any case, to advanced biodiversity solutions, which may in turn redound to the benefit of those private sector creditors. So I think that's something we really ought to be thinking about. Thanks.
By the way, Senator, with apologies, I got a plug. This TFCA, this is issue of debt. We have another session coming up at the Peru Pavilion at 2:30. Right. Okay.
Be optimistic. Our politics right now in the United States could lead anyone to be pessimistic. The scope and scale and speed of climate damage could lead anyone to be pessimistic. The degree of destruction being wrought through battlefields on millions of people could make anyone pessimistic. It's easy to wallow in pessimism. But the fundamental nature of humanity is to find solutions, and is to exceed expectations, and is to surprise ourselves at what's possible. For the United States and Vietnam to have not just reconciled, but to have found our way towards being positive, robust partners in combating climate change and in combating wildlife trafficking and in providing a path for opportunity for both our nations. You never would have expected that. When I was a child 40, 50 years ago, this future for the United States and Vietnam did not seem possible. There are so many things that I could take a few minutes and point you to where we are actually exceeding expectations in innovation, in collaboration, and in overcoming adversity. I still believe that the possibility that we will get on the other side of this climate challenge and leave to our grandchildren a more robust, more inclusive, more sustainable planet with energy systems that we can hardly imagine now, and with opportunity for the next generations around the world. I am very optimistic about that. I believe in that. But we need the positivity and energy of youth to help make it come true, and we need the wisdom and seasoning of people who've actually led global, competent, capable organizations to help make it true. So be optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.